The views and opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of this station, JVC Broadcasting Management, or its sponsors.
Welcome to Crime and Justice Radio, where we talk all things crime, justice, mayhem, and the courts with expert insiders and legal outcasts. I'm your host, Aida Leisenring. Normally, we'd have Mr. Bruce Barquette as my co-host. Today, he's unavailable, so I am very proud to announce that someone very, very big is filling his shoes. He is one of the most important guests we'll ever have on our shows, and some of you may have heard of him. Marty Tankliff, wrongfully convicted for the murder of his parents, spent 17 years in prison, exonerated, got a law degree, and is now a practicing lawyer, and someone I call a friend. Good evening, Marty. How are you?
Good evening. Thank you for having me, and thank you for Bruce being away so I could take over the co-host position tonight.
We love it. He's on an airplane somewhere, and he won't be hearing what we have to say about him.
He'll find a way to listen to us somehow. Of
course. We have a pretty exciting show. I'm not going to lie to you, Marty. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about you. And then we're also going to have an amazing guest at the second half, Stephen Brand. He's an attorney from Texas, but born and raised in Long Island. And he'll be talking about sex abuse cases, which are also extremely vulnerable to false allegations and wrongful convictions. Before I start, for those listeners, those very few listeners who don't know who you are, I'm going to tell them what I know about you, Marty. Your parents were brutally murdered when you were 17 years old in 1988 in Suffolk County. You called 911 and rendered first aid to your dying father. Rather than consoling you, a kid who had just witnessed his parents' last breaths, police interrogated you for hours, lied to you, and obtained a false confession. Then you stood trial as an orphan teenager with news cameras all over your case, and you were wrongfully convicted of their murders as a result, among other factors, your false confession. You were sentenced to 50 to life as a teenager. You spent nearly 2 decades in prison, during which time you studied and received an associate's degree, and steadily began drawing support for your case of actual innocence, including, by the way, Tony Soprano, or those who know him by his real name, James Gandolfini. Your conviction was finally overturned after serving 17 years in prison, thanks in part to one of your lawyers, Bruce Barquette, who you are subbing in for today. You faced a retrial, but then Attorney General at the time, Andrew Cuomo, who originally resisted your exoneration, finally agreed with your lawyers and declared you innocent and exonerated. And then what? You became a paralegal at Bruce Barquette's law firm where we worked together. Meanwhile, you sued the state and federal government and deposed all those responsible for your wrongful conviction. You were rightly awarded over $10 million. And rather than escaping to the Cayman Islands, which is what I would have done, you chose to go to law school. You graduated from Toro. You passed the New York State Bar in 2017. You officially became a lawyer in 2020. And now you're an attorney at Metcalf and Metcalf, representing individuals accused of crime. You've become an advocate for criminal justice reform. You're an adjunct professor at Georgetown University at the Making an Exoneree Clinic, which is its very own innocence project. And actually, you recently obtained an exoneration for Valentino Dixon, who was wrongfully convicted of murder and who spent his time in prison also painting beautiful golf landscapes, one of which was recently purchased by the Obamas. And last month, you were on the cover of the Law Journal for representing some of the Capitol rioters. When you hear that, what do you think? That's you.
It really is hard to imagine because I remember when I was in law school, I used to tell my wife that I'm a failure, I'm never going to be anything, I'm 37, 38, 39 years old. don't have a career, don't have a savings, don't have anything. And I remember her saying, after you've been out for 10 years or 11 years, let's have that conversation again. And it was about 10 or 11 years when we had that conversation. And here I had graduated from law school. I was an adjunct professor at Toro, an adjunct professor at Georgetown. And I kind of said, you know what, maybe she was right. And, it really was a defining moment because I knew that my path going forward was still growing and that I would make every difference in the world that I could. And
it's still growing.
It still is growing because we just started our 4th year of making an exoneree at Georgetown University, where you mentioned we obtained Valentino's Dixon. We believe we will have a few more in the coming year, months maybe. And in the near future, I will probably be co-counsel on a death penalty case and other cases around the country because of the advocacy work and the fact that I'm an attorney now.
I want to take you back to when you were 17 years old, before the fateful night. Did you want to be a lawyer?
No, I actually wanted to be the next Donald Trump. I wanted to be a successful businessman and go to the Wharton School of Business because my father was an entrepreneur and I was an entrepreneur. I had a baseball card business. I sold candy in high school. So that's the path I wanted to take.
How would you describe your childhood, your teen years?
They were great. I mean, I lived in an affluent area on the North Shore of Long Island. We had great summers, great family outings, great friends. And my friendship with Mark Howard, who I co-teach the class with at Georgetown, dates back to when we were 3 years old in lovey-dovey preschool.
Oh, my God. I knew that. He went to Harvard. And what's the terrible joke you guys make?
He went to Yale.
Oh, he went to Yale.
Yale.
Excuse me.
It's okay. They'll forgive you. I mean, and the joke is there's some seriousness that Mark went to Yale and Marty went to jail. But we say that with some joke and some jest, but there's truth to it. But the end result is that we came together to form a bond that's unlike any other. And we pay it forward by teaching this class at Georgetown.
Now, when you were 17 and dreaming of becoming the next Donald Trump, I want to take you to, I imagine, the worst night of your life, or one of many.
Yes.
When you found your parents in their condition, you called 911. What was going through your head at that point?
When I called 911, I'd only found my father. And I remember that I just couldn't fathom that this was real. You wake up for your first day of senior year, which is supposed to be a joyous day, but you wake up to this horror that no one should ever have to experience, and you just can't process that it's real. But I remember doing, the 911 operator was yelling at me to do certain things, and I remember following exactly what she said. And I remember within a short period of time, I had a family member who was at my house, who was there to comfort me, but that didn't last.
What do you mean? They were there. Did police arrived? How soon before police took you to an interrogation room?
Within a very short period of time. I was moved away from family. I was hidden. My uncle Mike Fox, was actually the family attorney who even showed up and spoke to a detective and said, I represent Marty, I don't want him spoken to. And law enforcement didn't care. Instead of me being taken to the hospital, which is where I wanted to go because that's where my father was, I was driven from Port Jeff all the way out to Yaphank, which was police headquarters.
Wow. And then you were taken into an interrogation room?
I was barefoot, wearing shorts and a sweatshirt, and I was taken into what they like to call the interview room, but it was an interrogation room. It was a windowless room with very little furniture, a metal desk with a big metal hook on it, 2 or 3 chairs, and a file cabinet. That's it. Now,
what I find fascinating about your case is, on many levels, I find many things fascinating about it, but among them is that 30% of wrongful convictions at least the DNA exonerations, are a result of false confessions. And I know lawyers and judges that are smart, that are educated, that have been practicing for decades, and they still don't believe how it is that an innocent person can falsely confess. Can you tell us how it can come to be?
What I try to do is I try to explain to people, let's simplify it. Remember when you and your siblings were home as a kid, your parents go out, somebody breaks a lamp. Your parents come home and they say, we're not going out for ice cream until somebody tells us they broke a lamp. And most of the time, somebody who didn't break the lamp says, I broke the lamp. And they want to go out for ice cream. And you kind of go, you just confessed to something. Now multiply that by 1,000,000 times where you're isolated from family, friends, you're deprived of food, water, bathroom. You are put into this closed room, there's no escape, and law enforcement, verbally and physically, will often tell you, you're not leaving this room till you tell us what we want to hear. And that can go on for hours.
And then you just break down.
You break down, and you also just want it to end. It gets to a point where no matter how many of the denials you do, a detective could say, Marty, we know you used this knife. And you can say, I didn't use a knife. I don't know what you're talking about. Their response was, just tell us you'll use the knife and we'll move on. And it gets to a point where in your heart, in your head, in your soul, you didn't do anything wrong, but you want the questioning to stop. You want that mental abuse and sometimes the physical abuse just to end because you want to get to your family.
Unbelievable. And we're going to talk about how police actually lied to you, and that was one of the techniques that they used to obtain your wrongful confession, which, by the way, you're not alone, obviously. There's other high-profile individuals that fell subject to it. Making a Murderer's Brendan Dassey with a low IQ. He was a minor without a parent. The Central Park Five, 4 out of 5 of them all falsely confessed, even though DNA cleared them. Jeffrey Deskovitz, also 17, he was lied to. And you. We'll be right back after this short sponsor break with Marty Tankliff.
Crime and Justice Radio is brought to you by the law firm of Barquette, Epstein, Kieran, Aldea, and Loturco, defending individuals accused of state and federal crimes, prosecuting the government for violations of your civil rights, fighting to overturn wrongful convictions, and seeking to make you whole if you've been injured in an accident. You can find them at www.barquetteepstein.com or call 516-745-1500. Barquette Epstein meets all your litigation needs from the Hudson to the Hamptons.
Welcome back to Crime and Justice Radio. I'm here with Marty Tankliff, who was wrongfully convicted, spent 17 years in prison before he was exonerated, and is now a practicing lawyer defending some high-profile individuals, you might say. Marty, before our break, we were talking about how false confessions occur. And a lot of people can't wrap their mind around it, but we know they happen. We've had tons of DNA testing that proves that the confessions were false. And I guess what I'm going to ask you is, what do we do about it?
One of the best things we can actually do is mandate the electronic recording of all interviews and interrogations, not simply the confession. Because, when law enforcement questions suspects, that questioning or the interrogation can be 9, 10, 11, 12 hours, which will break the individual, and then they will only record the last 10 minutes.
I've had that happen in a lot of cases. The client said, no, I was interrogated by 5 people, and then they turned the camera on an hour later or 2 hours later. So that's one step. And also, what about police lying to suspects? I remember being in law school and saying to myself, I can't believe the Supreme Court has authorized police to lie to obtain a confession.
Tragically, the Supreme Court allows law enforcement to lie. In my case, the detectives told me that my father had been pumped full of adrenaline, had woken up and identified me. They also told me that my mother had my hair in her hands. Under legislation that is currently pending in New York State, law enforcement would not be able to lie. When you lie to suspects and you obtain a false confession, it can potentially lead to an innocent person being convicted and imprisoned, allowing the guilty party to remain free. So if you can prevent and stop law enforcement from lying to suspects, it's a public safety issue. It's not just a criminal legislation issue, because we're going to save lives by making sure the innocent remain free and the guilty go to prison.
Have you been advocating for that? I know that you've testified in front of many congressional hearings, many legislative hearings with respect to criminal justice reform.
Since, I would say, my first year out, I've had the opportunity to testify before the New York State Senate, the New York State Assembly. I've testified before the New York City Council, the Maryland Senate, because I know if the interrogation that took place in my case was recorded, I wouldn't have served probably a day in prison. And the tragedy is that Suffolk County law enforcement actually had a policy and procedure in place about recording interviews and interrogations, especially in homicide cases. They just chose not to record it.
Instead, you went to prison, and you were literally an orphan at that point. You were 17 when you got charged. You were 19 when the trial ended. What was that first night in downstate like?
It's a night I'll never forget, because I remember there was a group of us in what we used to call the square. And they said, with the following individuals, follow us. And I remember just about every single one went one way, and all of a sudden they said, Tankleff, follow me. And I remember I was the only one being escorted through these long hallways, and I thought to myself, oh my God, I'm going to die. Because why would they only take me through these long hallways and not go with everyone else? And it wasn't until I reached the cell block that I realized that they weren't going to kill me, but it was a long walk.
I'm so sorry to hear that. People watch movies and they have prison scenes and show what life is like in prison. Do you ever see some of those movies?
I have.
Are they similar? Are they well characterized or not?
Some are. I mean, prison is not day camp. It's not, it's not the 5-star hotel. There's violence in prison, and it's not just the prisoners. The guards are abusive. The prison environment creates very hostile situations, and sometimes that violence erupts where it can be riots, stabbings, cuttings, serious altercations, gang activity. I was very thankful to get out alive, and you would no scars, no stabbings, no cuttings.
How'd you learn to survive in prison at such a young age? Did you have anyone give you advice?
There were a few people, what we would call old-timers, who said to me, listen, Marty, don't get involved in the gangs, don't get involved in homosexuality, don't get involved in drugs, don't gamble, and don't become a snitch. They said, focus on getting your education, and if you're innocent, spend as much time as you can in the law library, because you're going to have to figure out a way to fight yourself out of the system.
Unbelievable. Well, God bless that man for giving you sound advice. Now, I've had the pleasure of walking a few people out of prison or out of jail after they've been exonerated. Among them, I believe you knew him, was Barry Gibbs, who was set up by mob cop Eppolito. And I'll never forget, he wanted crab-stuffed lobster and insisted on a Vitabath. That was the first thing he wanted to do, was take a bath. And Vanessa Potkin, who's the post-conviction director of litigation at the Innocence Project, and I, in our suits, drew him a bubble bath in Barry Scheck's apartment. So, Marty, when you were released, what did you eat? What did you want to do? What did it feel like?
So the first thing I actually did is that when I drove away from the courthouse, I asked my family who I was with to stop at the gas station and get a cup of coffee. And they said, why is that? And I said, because during the post-conviction proceedings, the sheriffs used to get me a cup of coffee every day. And I knew that would be the last time I would ever have to have a cup of coffee at that gas station. But I remember, the first day getting out, going back to my family's house, and just eating food from what was West End Cafe, because it was one of my favorite restaurants right before I went to prison.
Is that the one in Garden City?
It is. It's the one in Garden City.
They're not sponsoring the show, but I do like West End Cafe.
And it was actually also the restaurant that the first time Bruce took me out for lunch we went to.
How was that?
I ordered duck tacos, mango iced tea, and truffle French fries. And Bruce just looked at me. He goes, "What happened to a cheeseburger and fries and a Coke?"
Of course.
And I kind of said to him, I said, you do realize I was just in prison for almost 18 years. I'd like something new and different and really good. And he said, "I can't blame you."
And I gather, is the food as bad as it would appear in prison? It
is. And unless you have the opportunity to end up being in one of the honor blocks where the luxuries are a little bit more accessible, and you can make your own food and have access to food.
Barry Gibbs kept a smuggled hot plate and would barter Newports for a slab of meat from the butcher and cook it at 2 a.m, I hear.
Yeah, that's all possible.
Well, we're going to take a short commercial break. When we come back, we're going to talk to Marty about being sworn in, about how he currently represents the Capitol rioters and how they're being treated in pretrial detention. Stick around. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Crime and Justice Radio. I'm your host, Aida Leisenring, and with me today is Marty Tankleff. Marty, prior to the break, we were discussing videotaping interrogations, and you mentioned something interesting, how it's a public safety issue. Because if you're able to view and detect how a false confession occurred, then you're going to start focusing on the person you ought to be focusing on, the real killer, right? And in your case, you went to prison and you were innocent, and the real killer got away. Do you know who the real killer was?
We've publicly identified who the individuals were involved. It was Jerry Stuerman, Todd Stuerman, Glenn Harris, Peter Kent, and Joseph Creedon.
And they knew your family.
They knew. Jerry Stuerman was my father's business partner who owed my father over $500,000. Todd Stuerman was a drug dealer on Long Island who used enforcers to commit violent acts, and one of those enforcers was Joseph Creedon.
Wow. And where are they now?
Joseph Creedon and Peter Kent are both deceased. Glenn Harris, I believe, is still alive, and the Stuermans are alive as well. And
why haven't they been arrested?
It's a really good question. I think one of the reasons why is that after I was exonerated, the executive order was left with the Attorney General, and when it passed down to Spoda, we knew Spoda wasn't going to go after the Stuermans because when Spoda was in private practice, he represented the Stuermans.
Now, hold up a moment. Let's talk about Spoda. He was recently in the news. Obviously, he was convicted by the Eastern District of witness tampering and obstruction of justice for covering up Chris Loeb's beating while he was in detention. But we also know that his misconduct ran much deeper. And recently there were revelations that he was targeting the then county executive, Stephen Levy. Now, what's ironic is Spoda fervently opposed your motion to vacate your conviction. Fast forward to 2020. Was it February or January that you were sworn in?
February 5th of 2020.
February 5th of 2020. 2 months prior to that, Spoda gets convicted. You get sworn in to the bar. And then shortly thereafter, Spoda gets disbarred. What are your thoughts?
I think Bruce said it best. He goes, imagine in 10 years, he goes, you went from 50 years to life in prison to becoming an attorney. And Tom Spoda, who fought to keep you in prison in those 10 years, is heading to prison himself. And it was one of those moments you kind of said that, it's not really justice, but I think what's happening now is that when we've talked about all the corruption, all the illegal acts that Spoda and his henchmen were involved with, I think we're just learning the tip of the iceberg. And as you said, that Spoda was extremely opposed to my post-conviction application. And what was so offensive about it is that here is the number one person who represented the people of the state of New York, who had represented the people, Jerry Stuerman and Todd Stuerman, people we were identifying as being involved in my parents' murders. He represented them in private practice.
That's kind of a conflict there, Marty.
It absolutely is. We raised that there was an issue, and he said, and we filed the motions. The judge denied the motions. It gets even worse, though, because Tom Spoda said, well, I'm going to appoint an investigator in this office to investigate the case. The one investigator who he appointed was the only one in the office that had worked with K. James McCready, the lead detective in my case, in the 80s.
Well, it sounds like a joke. People hear this stuff and they go, well, that can't happen. But it did. And it didn't happen in the 1940s. It happened in, what year was this?
It was in the 2000s.
Yep. Unbelievable. So, Marty, you represent some people would say they're popular. Some people would call them very unpopular. You represent a number of Capitol rioters. All right. What's going on with their case?
So one of them was recently released on bail, and he probably should never have been there because
the desk sitter, I call him.
Yeah.
He sat on Pelosi's desk.
He did, but it's not really Pelosi's desk; it's the people's desk. I mean, it's our taxpaying dollars that paid for that desk. But really, what's so horrible about it is that these individuals are being housed in horrible conditions. They're being denied basic human rights, haircuts, showers. And even worse is that they are presumed innocent, and their ability to effectively communicate with their lawyers is hindered beyond belief.
And what's so interesting and fascinating about the law when you look at federal punishment versus state punishment, what they did is, in New York State, trespass, a violation, not even a crime, make it a federal case, and they're facing 10 years in prison.
It really is astronomical that you could trespass and disrupt a proceeding that you may not even be aware of was going on, and face years in prison.
So, insurrection or glorified trespass?
Glorified trespass.
Got it. We have a very special individual who we're all connected, the three of us, in a bizarre way, through Cal Harris's case. Our firm, you were working on that matter as well, ultimately exonerated through a fourth trial. Cal Harris, who was wrongfully accused of killing his wife. And at some point, we needed to get material witnesses in Texas. And that's how I met Stephen Brand. Stephen Brand is a former prosecutor and now a criminal defense attorney in Austin, Texas. He was born in Brooklyn, raised in Long Island. He has defended every kind of charge imaginable, from murder, rape, drug sale, assault to domestic violence. He also served as a U.S. Air Force officer in the Judge Advocate General Corps, obtaining clemency for a Bronze Star winner who had been court-martialed in Iraq. As a prosecutor, he litigated the widely publicized West Campus murders in Austin. To our old listeners, he was a member of the prosecution team in the case of former U.S. House of Representatives Majority Leader Tom DeLay. Stephen Brand, welcome to Crime and Justice Radio. How are you doing?
Good. How are you? Thank you for that. I wasn't expecting that. Thank you, Aida. Nice to meet you again, Marty.
Nice to meet you, Steve, again.
And so what's interesting is Marty, to me, is the face of wrongful convictions. And Steve, you and I talk on the phone all the time, especially now about the Me Too era. Believe her, don't cross-examine victims of sexual abuse cases and so forth. And while we're making so many progresses on wrongful conviction cases, we seem to have gone backwards with sexual assault cases. We're lessening due process rights, and they are extremely vulnerable to wrongful convictions. I think it's one of the highest rates of types of cases where you'll find wrongful convictions. So, Stephen, tell us a little about that.
Yeah, I mean, anytime society switches to where you're having kind of mob mentality make the laws, whether it's, and get behind causes, whether it's labeling something an insurrection like Marty's taking care of, and everybody's like, I can't even believe these people are allowed to get trials. Why did Derek Chauvin, why was he permitted to get a trial?
Right.
And you lose focus on the underlying core of our constitutional principles and our legal principles, which is the innocent unless proven guilty. And I say unless intentionally instead of until, because you don't know. But that concept of innocent unless proven guilty. And the movement came forward with the hashtag #MeToo, and built around it was this cause of you need to believe women when they make these allegations, just out of the gate. And you start treating them differently than you would any other person.
And just
if you had
to stop you for a moment, according to the FBI data, and I think this is even outdated, up to 5,100 allegations of rape every year were deemed false or baseless after an investigation, which was an average of 5.5%, which might seem low, but that's a rate 5 times higher than for any other type of crime.
And I bet you none of them were actually prosecuted for filing false allegations.
I bet not one. And the sad thing about that is, even after that, many people will continue to label them quote-unquote survivors. And that just kills me. Because here you have the justice system at work, you have somebody you're representing, jury comes back, they find them not guilty, and then people will write articles in different media journals, and they'll say, see, this survivor didn't get her justice. And it's like, well, wait, the only thing I'm looking for now is a possible prosecution against her for potentially making this up. What do you mean, the survivor didn't get her justice? And what's concerning is politicians who are seizing upon that and trying to go farther and saying, well, we didn't get the results we wanted. If we change the law, we probably will. And that's where you're starting to see states like California switching over to affirmative consent statutes versus lack of consent statutes, just making it that much harder to defend these cases.
So by affirmative, just explain that to me. Affirmative consent statute would mean that if the girl didn't affirmatively, I'm assuming it's a girl, it can be anyone, obviously, didn't expressly state you're allowed to do this, then it's rape?
Right. So and where are you going to get that? What are you going to have, like dueling apps that you create? It's like, hey, send me that you consent on the app, and then
I've never affirmatively consented.
Right.
It sounds like a Law and Order episode where people have to sign contracts to consent.
Right.
I mean, it's becoming that crazy. And, a lot of the literature you see and the articles you see come from these statistics that say, well, 1 in every 5 women are sexually assaulted on college campuses. And when you go back to that underlying data, that now is finally starting to be under attack. Actually, it started probably around 7 years ago. There was a Time magazine article on it saying, well, what did this data really show? And what they had done was they only surveyed women from 2 different college campuses, and the response rate was only about 42%. And built into that were questions about sexual assault, but sexual assault where it wasn't even defined as you would think in your mind necessarily as rape. And then even out of the women who were surveyed, when they were asked whether they considered it to be rape, like a huge percentage said, no, they really didn't. So that 1 in 5 number is so skewed, but the problem is politicians are now using that number consistently to do campus legislation. And now President Biden is going back into Title IX, and Title IX involves where you're a guy, let's say, on a university campus, you're accused of sexual assault. Under Trump and the education secretary, that was starting to be loosened from before, where now it's like, oh, no, you have a right to cross-examine your accuser in these university settings. And now Biden is trying to set up his education secretary to revisit that. So they might again try to strip away this right of cross-examination in a university setting.
So in other words, you're accused by someone of rape.
Right.
You're in college. You're, say, a junior. Obviously, it's a horrific allegation. Often these cases are covered by the media, so your name is permanently on Google. And you say, I'm innocent. I didn't do this. I want my attorney to cross-examine her because I was here, or this is what happened, or this is the conversation that took place. This is how many drinks she had. This is how many drinks I had. And all those questions aren't asked of her if Biden ultimately reverses Betsy DeVos's due process implementations. Is that right?
Potentially, yeah. And think about that. I mean, you're at name whatever university, we'll go close to home. We'll say Hofstra. You're in your senior year of Hofstra University, and you're a guy and you're just looking forward to graduation. You got a job lined up. You go out, you drink the same amount as this other girl who's drinking with you. You both wind up, you go to a hotel, you have sex. He wakes up the next morning and is like, I don't remember anything and I wouldn't have had sex with this person. I'm going to call the police. And they do an investigation at the university and they're like, oh, looks like there was an allegation made against you, and we tend to believe it. We're going to say it's a preponderance of the evidence, which is just more likely than not. You're kicked out of school. Sorry, you're not graduating. Good luck anywhere else with this stigma on your transcript.
And then you're shunned for life. And it's going to be very difficult for you to get a job. Everyone Googles each other's names nowadays. And we've had, actually, you mentioned Hofstra, but there was the famous Hofstra rape case where the individual was actually a criminal case. And I want to say, thank God it was a criminal case because he got due process, right? Same with Duke, the lacrosse players, they got due process. Same with the football players at Sacred Heart because it was a criminal allegation. I'm not suggesting they be criminally charged. They got due process. But what was incredible is that this wasn't a little hearing on campus by individuals that don't have expertise in this area. These were police officers trained in assessing credibility of witnesses, and they originally believed the accusers, and then DNA evidence or video surveillance or text messages ultimately revealed that the accusations were false.
Well, I mean, there's so many cases like that. It's people think that they could tell somebody's credibility, and the bad news for them is they're often wrong. And it's not a reality show. It's not a game show. The stakes aren't that, well, if you're wrong, oh, well, I'm kicked off the show. I don't get a rose. It's if you're wrong and there's no other evidence.
Or what if you're confused, right? What if you had an experience, you don't feel good about it. You don't feel right. You mention it to a counselor. You mention it to someone because you're trying to work it out. Next thing, the school gets involved. There's a hearing. Your name might be disclosed and you want to take it back, or maybe you just want to get counseling and therapy and try to reconcile what happened. This push to force people that think they might be victims to either testify in trials, which often they don't want to, right? Or to come forward on a school campus investigation, I don't think is consistent with autonomy, right? Human autonomy. Like I want to be the master of my universe. I want to say whether or not I want to go forward. I want to say whether or not I want to prosecute. But a lot of prosecutors now just subpoena, they get grand jury subpoenas and threaten these individuals with no choice but to testify.
It would probably benefit everybody if during this whole process there was some kind of recording. This way we're not relying on he said, she said, or what somebody puts in a police report.
Oh, I agree. I agree. And here in Texas, we do have those recordings. The sad thing we're seeing in Texas now is there's a nonprofit group that has worked their way into law enforcement, and they're providing these quote-unquote soft rooms to interview the victims in. So, and they're only labeled a victim is because they're the one complaining that something happened. So they're labeled a victim right away once they make their statement. But the investigator, the detective, knows absolutely nothing about the case, has not interviewed any witnesses, has not looked at any video, has not received any DNA back, hasn't seen a sexual assault nurse examination usually by that time, and just says, I'm going to believe this person. And now they put him in a soft room, which has a comfortable couch, it has swivel chairs, it has blankets that are weighted to give them comfort. And the person who's presumed innocent, when they're interrogated, they get those 1970s linoleum tile floors with the cinder block wall. That's what the person who's presumed innocent gets, which is just ridiculous. It's like turning the justice system on its head.
100%. And I really do think we're going backwards with sexual abuse cases. And there are, unfortunately, too many true victims of sexual assault and rape. Something we're actually going to talk about next week is for those individuals that were raped, they're often tasked with the responsibility of identifying an individual. Marty, I would like you to tell us a little about Jennifer Thompson, who's going to be our guest next week.
Jennifer Thompson is an amazing woman who identified an individual that was not her rapist, but she was led to believe that he was. Law enforcement reinforced her false or her erroneous identification, and Ronald Cotton was put in prison for a very long time. But thankfully, Ronald and Jennifer are friends now. And the real individual was eventually caught.
And we're so excited to talk to Jennifer Thompson, who's done so much to deal with mistaken identification, educate the world. And she's going to talk about Healing Justice, a program that helps all those affected by wrongful convictions. Stephen Brand, thank you for being here. Marty Tankliff, it's been such a pleasure, guys.
Thank you.
The views and opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of this station, JVC Broadcasting Management, or its sponsors. Management or its sponsors. Management or its sponsors. Management or its sponsors. Management or its sponsors.